The bundle of damp, foul-smelling fabric hit my chest before falling to the floor, while the laughter of 3 young women flooded my own living room. I am Doris. I am 68 years old, and my hands bear the calluses of someone who raised these walls brick by brick. The document that holds the fate of this property rests in a safe, whose combination only I know. And today, the clock started ticking. The physical impact of the clothes against my body didn't hurt as much as the silence that followed. A thick silence that settled into the stale air of the room. I looked at the garments scattered over the carpet I had vacuumed myself that very morning. There was a cheap silk blouse stained with makeup at the collar, tight sweatpants that still held the acrid stench of dried sweat, and a pair of socks that had rolled right up to the toe of my orthopedic shoes. The cloying, cheap perfume radiating from Brittany, my daughter-in-law, mixed with the stench of dirty laundry, creating a suffocating atmosphere that perfectly summed up what my life had become over the last 2 years. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't let my shoulders drop. Behind me, the muffled sound of the television coming from the end of the hall reminded me that in this house, I was completely alone in my trench. That television was turned on by Arthur. My husband Arthur is 72 years old and has perfected the art of cowardice with a mastery that sometimes, in my darkest moments, I almost admire. We have been married for 45 years. In our youth, he worked at a lumber mill, and I made my living as an upholsterer. My fingers still carry the scars from the curved needles used to stretch heavy leather over hardwood frames, from stapling rough fabrics until my joints screamed in agony. With the money from those restored sofas, from those dining chairs brought back to life, we bought this land. I mixed the cement myself on weekends. I painted every frame of every window myself. Arthur helped, of course, but his spirit was always fragile, terrified of conflict, prone to ducking his head at the slightest sign of a storm. Now, with old age, that fragility has hardened into a shell of indifference. When Brittany raises her voice, when the slammed doors from my son Jason make the windows rattle, Arthur simply adjusts his hearing aid to turn it off, cranks up the volume on the football games, and vanishes into his own mind. He has decided that peace is bought by surrendering territory, ignoring the fact that invaders are never satisfied with just one corner. The invasion didn't start with screaming, nor with dirty laundry thrown in my face. It started with tears and broken promises, the way the worst family tragedies usually begin. Jason, my only son, had tried to open a business importing cell phone parts. He took out loans he couldn't pay. He trusted partners who bailed on him at the first sign of bankruptcy. And at 40 years old, he found himself staring into a financial abyss with a wife who wasn't about to give up her lifestyle. I remember the night they showed up at my door. It was pouring rain, one of those November storms that turn the streets into rivers of mud. Jason had red eyes, slumped shoulders, the living image of defeat. Brittany stood beside him, clutching a designer suitcase that clashed absurdly with the misery of the moment. She was crying too, or at least faking it, with a conviction that at the time moved me. "It will only be for a few months," Mum Jason begged as we sat at the kitchen table while I poured them hot coffee. "Just until I get a steady job and we can rent a small place. I swear we won't be a burden." I looked at my son, the boy whose school costumes I had sewn, whose scraped knees I had bandaged, and I felt that ancient pull in my gut that dooms mothers to sacrifice their peace for the survival of their blood. I said yes. Arthur nodded silently from his chair, already surrendering his territory. I gave them the guest room, the biggest one after the master, the one with the large window overlooking the rose garden I had planted myself 3 decades ago. I made room for them in my closets, cleared out 3 shelves in the fridge, and handed them a set of keys. That was my first tactical error. I thought I was opening the doors to a temporary shelter, when in reality I was handing over the keys to my own prison. The first few months they kept up the facade of gratitude. Brittany woke up early, made breakfast, swept the patio, and called me Miss Doris with a sweetness that made my teeth ache. Jason got a job as a route supervisor at a logistics company, a decent gig that paid the basic bills. But human beings can't fake their true nature for long. Brittany's courtesy had an expiration date, and it expired the exact moment she realised Arthur wouldn't enforce a single rule, and that I, in my desperate bid to keep family peace, preferred to stay quiet rather than start a war under my own roof. The metamorphosis was gradual, calculated, almost imperceptible at first. First, their contributions to the household expenses vanished. The money they were supposedly going to hand over at the end of the month to help with the power and water simply stopped being mentioned. When one day, after getting an electric bill that was double the usual amount, I asked Jason about it, Brittany cut in before my son could even form a word. "We are saving for our own place, Doris," she told me, dropping the miss for the first time. "We thought the goal was for us to get independent quickly. If we pay you rent, we'll never be able to leave. Besides, this house is already paid off. It's not like it costs you more to have us here." The logic was twisted, perverse, but Jason looked at her with pure devotion and nodded, begging me for patience with his eyes. I shoved the bill into my apron pocket and paid it out of my retirement check. I stayed quiet. I watched, and I started taking mental notes of every move on the board. Then came the hostile takeover of the spaces. My potted ferns and African violets were banished to the backyard because, according to Brittany, they gave her allergies and made the house look like an old lady lived there. In their place appeared shiny plastic decorations, fashion magazines scattered across the tables, shoes dumped in the hallway. The kitchen, my sanctuary for 40 years, turned into a minefield. Brittany stopped cooking and started ordering delivery almost every single night. The greasy pizza boxes, the half-eaten cartons of Asian takeout, the sticky cups, it was all left on the counter for me to clean up the next morning. If I didn't, the ants invaded the place. Jason would leave for work before the sun fully rose, blind and deaf to the disaster his wife left in her wake. When I tried to talk to him alone while making him a thermos of coffee one dawn, he cut me off with an impatience that hurt worse than any insult. "Mum, please, Brittany is depressed about our situation. Don't pressure her, just clean up whatever she messes up. I'll make it up to you later. Don't make a huge deal out of something so small." That was the exact moment I realised I had lost my son. He was no longer the man I had raised. He had mutated into the meat shield for a woman who despised me. And Brittany's contempt wasn't silent. It was active, loud, and profoundly cruel. Realising my passivity, seeing that I picked up her plates and scrubbed pans caked in grease without complaining, she started treating me not as a host, but as a live-in maid she had scored for free. Worse still, she spun a twisted narrative to justify her presence in the house to the outside world. I heard it for the first time about 8 months ago. Brittany was on the phone in the hallway, her voice echoing with that shrill pitch characteristic of someone who needs the entire world to pay attention to her words. "Yeah, girl, it is exhausting," she said, sighing dramatically. "Jason and I had to move in here to take care of his parents. They are getting really old, you know. Doris can barely keep it together, and Arthur is practically deaf. If we weren't here to keep the house running, they would fall apart. It is a massive sacrifice for our marriage, but family comes first." I was 10 feet away holding a laundry basket full of clean clothes that weighed a solid 20 pounds. Laundry that included her bedsheets and my son's work shirts. I felt the blood boiling in my veins, a furious heat that crawled up from my stomach to my throat. The lie was so colossal, so shameless, that for a split second I was ready to drop the basket, march right up to her, rip the phone out of her hands and scream the truth to whoever was on the other end of the line. I wanted to tell her she hadn't paid a single utility bill in a year and a half. I wanted to tell her she slept until noon. I wanted to tell her this house stayed standing because of my daily labour, the sweat off my brow and the money from my pension. But I stopped. My personality has always been that of a woman who thinks before she acts, who knows that wars aren't won with impulsive screaming in a hallway. As an upholsterer, I learnt that if you cut the fabric in a fit of frustration, you ruin the entire piece of furniture. You have to measure twice, take a deep breath, and cut only when you are absolutely certain the line is flawless. I gripped the plastic edges of the basket until my knuckles turned white. I turned around in silence and carried the laundry to the bedrooms. That day, something soft and maternal died inside me, and in its place, an ice-cold sentinel was born. That strategic coldness was what allowed me to endure the following months. I watched as Brittany invited her friends over more frequently, turning my living room into her private social club. I watched as Arthur retreated to his corner earlier and earlier, cranking up the volume on his games to block out reality. I watched Jason come home exhausted, kiss his wife on the forehead, and lock himself in their room, completely ignoring me unless he needed his uniform ironed. I kept cleaning, I kept cooking, I kept paying, but I also started organising my paperwork. I reviewed the deed to the house. I went to the notary in silence one Tuesday morning while they were asleep. I asked precise questions, got clear answers, and locked the resulting papers in the wall safe hidden behind the false back of the closet in my bedroom. A safe that Arthur had forgotten even existed, and for which only I had the combination. I was prepping the battlefield, waiting for the exact moment when Brittany's insolence would cross the point of no return. That moment arrived today, a Thursday afternoon that kicked off with a palpable tension in the air. Since noon, Brittany had been frantic. She announced that two of her best friends were coming over, women she knew from her days of supposed wealth, women who wore designer labels and drove brand new SUVs. Brittany wanted to impress them. She wanted to keep the charade alive that she was the lady of the manor, the self-sacrificing benefactor managing a massive estate. At 1 PM, she found me in the kitchen making a lentil stew. She stomped in, scowling, her arms crossed over her chest. "Doris, I need you to turn that off," she ordered, pointing at the pot. "The smell of poor people food is going to seep into the curtains." I ordered sushi platters and imported cheese boards. "My friends are getting here at 4. I want you to deep clean the living room, dust the furniture, and make sure the guest bathroom is spotless. And please, when they get here, do not hover around. I don't want you making them uncomfortable. You can stay in your room or go out to the patio with Arthur." I looked at her. I just looked at her. There wasn't an ounce of respect in her eyes, only the cold demand of someone who believes they have absolute power over an inferior. In another era, any woman of my generation would have raised a hand or unleashed an insult that would have made the walls shake. But not me. I nodded slowly. I turned off the burner under the lentil pot. I grabbed the dusting rag and headed to the living room. I cleaned. I polished the oak wood that I had varnished myself 20 years ago. I vacuumed the carpet. I scrubbed the guest bathroom until the tiles reflected my own tired but expressionless face. Arthur watched me from his armchair. He noticed the tension in my jaw, and without saying a single word, he stood up, grabbed his little portable radio, and slipped out the back door into the garden, fleeing the impending confrontation, just like always. At 4:15, the doorbell rang. I heard Brittany's heels clicking frantically down the hardwood hallway. She opened the door and a chorus of high-pitched voices and exaggerated gasps invaded the entryway. It was two women, predictably loaded down with flashy jewellery and perfumes that assaulted the senses. From the kitchen, where I had obediently retreated, I listened to the dynamic. Brittany guided them into the living room, pouring them white wine and arranging the platters of food that I'd been forced to take from the delivery guy and plate on my best ceramic serving dishes. The conversation was frivolous hollow, peppered with shrill laughter. They talked about vacations they could no longer afford, handbags they were dying to buy, and the lives of other people they looked down on. And as it was inevitable, the topic pivoted to me. "Oh, Brittany, this house really is huge," one of the voices said, dripping with fake admiration. "Doesn't it take a ton of work to keep it up? With how old your in-laws are getting, you must be exhausted. You have no idea, girl, Brittany replied, sighing with that theatricality that was already suffocating me. It is a full-time job. I literally have to shadow the old lady so she doesn't make a mess. She's losing her mind, you know. She forgets to clean, she cooks things that smell awful. But whatever, Jason begged me to be patient. We put a roof over their heads and feed them. The absolute least they can do is try not to get in the way too much. We put a roof over their heads. That phrase hung in the kitchen air heavy as an anvil. We put a roof over their heads in the house my calluses built, in the house whose deed is exclusively in my name because Arthur insisted on putting it in my name 3 decades ago to protect me if he passed away. In the house where I pay the electricity, the water, the gas, and even the Wi-Fi connection that Brittany uses to upload photos of her fake life to social media. I waited a few minutes, let them drink more wine, let them relax into their bubble of superiority. Then I grabbed an empty serving tray and walked toward the living room. My initial intention was simply to clear the dirty glasses, maintain my facade of submission just a little longer, mentally document the humiliation to feed my resolve. I stepped into the living room in silence. The 3 women were sitting on the main sofa, the exact sofa I had upholstered with a dark green velvet that took me months of saving to afford. Seeing me, Brittany's friends fell silent, looking me up and down with a cocktail of pity and disdain. Brittany tensed up. She didn't like her maid interrupting her stage play. Her eyes narrowed. She wanted to assert her authority. She wanted to make it crystal clear, right in front of her audience, who the real queen of the castle was. She stood up sharply, marched over to the hallway where she had intentionally left a hamper filled with her dirty laundry from the last 3 days, and hauled it back into the living room. She planted herself in front of me, barely 3 feet away. Her friends watched the scene with wide eyes, anticipating the show. Brittany reached into the hamper and yanked out a fistful of clothes. Without warning, without a shred of basic human decency, she threw the bundle straight at my chest. The impact of the damp, foul-smelling fabric made me take a half step back. The clothes hit the floor with a dull thud. "Wash this right now," Brittany barked, raising her voice to ensure every syllable bounced off the living room walls. Her tone was sharp, derogatory, loaded with a gratuitous cruelty. "I need that blouse for tomorrow," and scrubbed the sweatpants hard. "That's why we give you a free roof over your head in this house, so you can at least be useful for something. Don't think we're just going to keep you around as an ornament." The silence that followed was absolute. The television down the hall kept murmuring, but in the living room time seemed to freeze. One of the friends let out a nervous little giggle and brought her wine glass to her lips, looking away. The other one just locked eyes with me, waiting to see if the fragile old woman was going to cry, beg, or have a total nervous breakdown. I didn't do any of those 3 things. I kept my gaze fixed on Brittany's face. I saw the arrogance in her tilted chin, the defiance in her dark eyes, the desperate need for validation hiding behind her cruelty. She wanted me to react. She wanted me to scream at her so she could tell her friends, "Look, I told you, she's crazy. She's impossible to live with." If I had exploded, I would have handed her the exact ammunition she needed to justify her behaviour to my son and to the world. But I am a strategist. I have survived poverty, back-breaking labour, a husband who was absent in spirit, and the crushing disappointment of a weak son. A spoilt little girl playing house wasn't going to break me with a wad of dirty laundry. I didn't say a single word. My face betrayed 0 emotion. Slowly, with the deliberate pacing of my 68 years, I bent my knees. The pop of my joints was the only sound in the room. I reached out my calloused hands and picked up the stained silk blouse, the sweatpants reeking of body odour, and the socks. I pressed them against my apron. I stood up, keeping my back perfectly straight, never breaking eye contact with Brittany. Her haughty smirk faltered for a fraction of a second when faced with my absolute silence, with the utter lack of submission in my eyes. There was no defeat in my gaze. There was a verdict. I turned around. I walked past her friends who pulled their legs back as if terrified my presence might infect them with some disease, and I walked down the hardwood hallway. Behind me, I heard Brittany's exaggerated sigh. "Oh my God, you really have to show them who is actually in charge," she said, her voice regaining its swagger now that I was walking away. "It is like dealing with toddlers." Anyway, pour some more wine, girls. The laughter erupted again, filling my house with an echo of mockery that embedded itself in the walls. I walked to the end of the hall, cutting through the kitchen until I reached the laundry room. The cold tile floor beneath my feet helped center my thoughts. I flicked on the fluorescent light. I looked at the white washing machine I had bought with my own savings 3 years ago. I looked at the detergent, the fabric softener, the scrubbing brushes, and then my eyes drifted to the right corner of the room. There, stacked neatly, were the black trash bags. Heavy-duty industrial plastic bags I used for hauling away yard waste. The clock had started ticking. The indignity had hit its absolute limit, and the debt had just been quantified. I threw Brittany's clothes onto the closed lid of the washing machine. The smell of sweat and cheap perfume filled the cramped space. I stepped over to the corner, grabbed one of the thick black bags and snapped it open with a sharp flick of my wrists. The sound of the crinkling plastic cracked like a gunshot in the laundry room. I shoved the silk blouse inside. I shoved the sweatpants inside. I shoved the socks inside, but I didn't stop there. The decision was made. The plan was in motion, and there was no force on this earth that could make me back down. I pulled the laundry room door shut behind me, making sure the latch clicked firmly into place, isolating myself from the noise in the living room, ready to execute the opening move of the end game. The thick black plastic of the industrial bag crinkled between my rough fingers as I opened it all the way. I didn't stop with the makeup-stained silk blouse, nor with the sweatpants reeking of stale sweat, nor with the socks Brittany had thrown at my chest with the insolence of someone who believes they are untouchable. My eyes swept the small laundry room, landing on the overflowing wicker hamper my daughter-in-law had dragged in there that very morning. It was a mountain of negligence and vanity. There were designer jeans with rhinestones on the pockets, tight dresses that smelled like cigarette smoke and nightclubs, lace underwear she always demanded I hand wash with mild soap, and fine knit sweaters she left dumped in random corners of my house. All of it was sitting right there, waiting for my 68-year-old hands, the same hands that had mixed the cement for the foundation of this property to restore the cleanliness that their owner utterly lacked on the inside. I grabbed the wicker hamper by the handles and dumped it straight into the black bag. The garments cascaded down, mixing with the dust and dried leaves left at the bottom of the plastic. I didn't feel anger. Anger is a hot, reckless emotion that makes your hands shake and clouds your judgment. What I felt was absolute clarity, cold and sharp as broken glass. I plunged my arms deep into the bag and pushed the clothes down hard, compacting the fabric to make more room. I grabbed a second bag from the shelf and repeated the process with the coats and jackets hanging carelessly from the rack by the back door. Items Brittany hoarded there, claiming the closets in the guest room were too small for her wardrobe. I tied off the ends of both bags with blind knots, pulling the plastic so tight my knuckles turned white. They were heavy. They weighed almost as much as 2 years of silent humiliations, of unpaid bills, of dirty dishes abandoned on my counter, and of blatant disrespect in front of guests. But my back, used to hauling rolls of leather and solid wood frames for decades in the upholstery shop, did not buckle. I dragged the first bag across the tile floor to the side door that opened onto the cobblestone alley, and then went back for the second. The wall clock in the kitchen read 4:35 p.m. In my neighbourhood, the municipal garbage truck runs on an ironclad schedule on Thursdays. It rolls by at exactly 4:40, announcing its arrival with the throaty roar of its diesel engine and the sharp squeal of its air brakes. I kicked the side door open. The afternoon sun hit my face, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. In the distance, just 2 blocks away, I heard the unmistakable sound of the truck turning the corner. I dragged the bags to the concrete curb I had levelled myself 20 years ago. I stood by the edge of the street, smoothing my apron over my stomach, and waited. The massive white and green vehicle hissed to a halt in front of my house. Hanging off the back, gripping the metal bar with the familiarity of a lifetime, was Mac. Mac is a sun-weathered man with broad shoulders and an easy smile, who's been working these streets for 15 years. He knows every neighbour. He knows who recycles, who sneaks construction debris into the trash, and who offers him a glass of ice water on summer days. I always kept a pitcher of lemonade for him in July and baked sweetbread for him in December. Loyalties in working-class neighbourhoods aren't signed on paper. They are built through everyday respect. Mac hopped off onto the curb, wiping the sweat from his forehead with his forearm. Seeing me standing next to two massive bundles, he raised a bushy eyebrow. "Good afternoon, Miss Doris," he greeted me, walking over to the bags. "Wow, looks like you decided to do some deep cleaning today." "Emptying out the attic. These bags weigh like they've got rocks inside." "Good afternoon, Mac," I replied, my voice sounding as steady and monotonous as the truck's engine. "It's not the attic, just hoarded trash, things that are completely useless now, taking up space and attracting pests. I needed to get them out of my house once and for all." Mac nodded without asking further questions. That is the virtue of hard-working people. They understand there are burdens a person just needs to throw away without having to explain themselves. He grabbed the first bag by the knot, bent his knees, and heaved it into the steel jaws of the truck's hopper with a grunt of effort. Then he did the same with the second. The silk blouse, the exclusive jeans, the lace underwear. It all landed on a mattress of organic waste, soggy cardboard and rotting food scraps from the entire neighbourhood. "Hit it, kid," Mac yelled to the driver, slapping the side of the truck with an open palm. I stood there motionless on the curb and watched. The hydraulic mechanism roared to life with a low hum. The massive steel plate came down without mercy, trapping the black bags. The thick plastic held for a fraction of a second before bursting under the colossal pressure. Through the jagged tear, I watched the shiny silk of that blouse Brittany needed for tomorrow irreversibly tangle with coffee grounds and rotting fruit peels. I watched the machine shred, crush, and swallow the entire wardrobe, shoving it deep into the darkness of the container, until no trace of it remained. The sound of metal crushing fabric was in that exact instant the most beautiful symphony I had heard in years. "All set," Miss Doris, Mac said, swinging back onto the rear bar. "Have a good afternoon and take care of yourself. You're looking a little pale." "I am perfectly fine, Mac. Better than ever," I answered, and it was the absolute truth. The truck rumbled away, taking the first installment of the debt with it, leaving behind a bitter cloud of diesel exhaust that I breathed in deeply. I stepped back into the house through the side door and through the deadbolt. From the end of the hallway, the echoes of Brittany and her guests' shrill laughter still drifted from my living room, completely oblivious to the execution that had just taken place mere feet away. I didn't head toward them. I walked in silence to my bedroom, the master suite at the far end of the opposite corridor. I opened the door and locked it behind me. The room was dimly lit, bathed in that dusty stillness inhabited by old marriages, when love has been replaced by habit and exhaustion. Arthur wasn't there. He was surely still hiding in the furthest corner of the garden, tuning into his radio so he wouldn't have to hear the world falling apart. I went straight to the heavy oak armoire that took up the entire left wall. I pushed aside the thick winter coats that smelled of mothballs and pressed on the wooden backboard. It gave way with a soft click, revealing the small safe embedded in the concrete. I spun the steel dial. 4:17:31. The metal door swung open smoothly. Inside, protected in a clear plastic folder, rested the original deed to the property. I pulled it out and sat on the edge of the bed, turning on the nightstand lamp. I ran my fingers over the stamped paper, feeling the raised texture of the signatures and the official seals. The document was in my name, exclusively mine. Doris Carmen Vance. When we bought this land, Arthur had insisted on doing it this way. Back then, he worked at the lumber mill, surrounded by giant saws and dangerous machinery. One day, a co-worker of his lost an arm. Another lost his entire life, crushed by pine logs. The terror of leaving me destitute if he died in a workplace accident drove him to put the only asset we had under my absolute control. Over the decades, Arthur forgot that legal detail, assuming that marriage turned everything into a shared blur. Jason, our son, grew up believing the house was his guaranteed inheritance from the patriarch. And Brittany, in her infinite arrogance, assumed that by manipulating Jason and dominating Arthur, she already had the keys to the castle in her pocket. None of the three remembered that in the eyes of the state, this dirt, these bricks, and this roof belonged solely to me. I put the deed into my black leather purse, along with my ID card and the water and power bills paid from my pension. I took off my orthopedic house shoes. I slipped on a pair of sensible, closed-toe street shoes. I fixed my grey hair in front of the vanity mirror and left the room. I walked down the hall, stepping carefully to keep the wood from creaking. I passed the living room without looking inside. I only heard the clinking of wine glasses and my daughter-in-law's voice saying, "The poor thing just can't track things anymore, girls." I gave her a blouse to wash, and she probably fell asleep in the kitchen. I slipped out the front door, pulling it shut in total silence. The office of Harrison Vance was 15 blocks away, on a tree-lined avenue where old neighbourhood shops blended with modern bank branches. Harrison wasn't just a respected notary and attorney. He was an ally of a breed you rarely see anymore. He had known my family since before Jason was born. He was the one who drafted the purchase contracts for the land, the one who advised me when I wanted to formalise my little upholstery business, and the one who witnessed my hands go from soft to being covered in scars from hard labour. I arrived at his office at 5:15. The brass bell above the glass door announced my entry. The smell of old paper, fresh coffee, and floor wax wrapped around me, instantly offering me a sense of order and legality that my own house had lost. Harrison was sitting behind his mahogany desk, adjusting his thick-rimmed glasses while reading a file. When he looked up and recognised me, a genuine smile lit up his wrinkled face. But the smile vanished quickly when he noticed the rigid set of my jaw and the way I was clutching my purse to my chest. "Doris," he said, standing up immediately. "What a surprise. Come in, please, sit down. Is something wrong? Is Arthur all right?" I opened my purse, pulled out the clear plastic folder, and slid it across the polished surface of the desk. Arthur is alive. Harrison, whether he's all right is another story, but he's breathing, I answered, my tone stripped of any emotional decoration. I've come because I need us to execute what we discussed hypothetically the last time I came in for a consultation. I need the official document, Harrison. You explained to me yourself that since my son and his wife do not pay rent, do not have a lease agreement, and do not contribute to the structural expenses, the law considers them occupants by tolerance. As the sole registered owner, you said, I have the absolute right to revoke that tolerance and demand their eviction from the property. I want it in writing with seals and signatures that their permission to inhabit my property is revoked. I want the document to establish a strict, non-negotiable 30-day legal deadline for them to empty the house, remove their belongings, and hand over the keys. And I want it made crystal clear that if they don't, we will proceed with law enforcement. He was a man of the law, but he also knew the weight of human pain. Doris, listen to me carefully, he warned, in a soft voice, leaning toward me. I will draft whatever you ask. My duty and my loyalty lie with you, but I want you to understand the consequences of walking through this door. Jason is your son. If you hand him an eviction notice signed by a notary, the rupture will be permanent. There will be no going back. Your daughter-in-law will use this to turn him against you forever. Are you absolutely certain you want to start this war? I thought of my banished plants, my rejected cooking, my life reduced to servitude in the house I built. I am not starting the war, Harrison. The war started the day I handed them the keys to my house, and they decided I was just an annoying piece of old furniture. I replied, my voice ringing metallic and final. The fabric is already cut. I just need to sew the final seam. Draft the document. I will pay your fees in cash right now. He called his assistant, dictated the precise terms, cited the corresponding articles of the Civil Code, and 40 minutes later he placed 3 copies of an official, stamped and numbered document bearing his firm's letterhead in front of me. I signed each page with a steady hand. The stroke of my pen was fast, dark, and absolute. I put the copies in my purse. I said goodbye to Harrison with a handshake and walked out onto the street. The afternoon air was starting to cool, but I felt a clean, controlled fire burning in my chest. The walk back home felt shorter. When I slid the key into the lock of the front door, the silence that greeted me was thick and sticky. Brittany's friends had already left. I stepped into the entryway and walked toward the living room. The scene was desolate. There were wine glasses stained with lipstick scattered across the side tables, leftover sushi drying out on the ceramic platters I had washed, crumpled napkins on the floor, and throw pillows tossed haphazardly. The smell of cheap perfume and alcohol hung heavily in the air. From the end of the hall, I heard Brittany's frantic footsteps. She darted out of the guest room, violently pulling drawers open and slamming them shut. She was wearing shorts and a basic t-shirt. Her hair was a mess, and her face, stripped of the haughty smirk she had worn hours earlier, displayed a mix of confusion and mounting panic. Seeing me standing in the doorway of the living room, she stopped dead in her tracks. Her eyes went wide. "Doris!" she exclaimed, completely forgetting the condescending tone she used in front of her guests. "Where the hell are my clothes?" I went to the laundry room, and the washer is empty. The hamper is gone. My jackets aren't on the rack by the door. Where did you put them? I need that silk blouse for a dinner tonight. I did exactly what you asked. I answered, my voice sounding calm, almost monotonous amidst the chaos she was starting to project. You said the house smelled like poor people food, that we needed to maintain a standard for your friends. I noticed there was a lot of garbage piling up, attracting bad smells and cluttering the common areas. I simply maintained order, just like you said we needed to. I took advantage of the municipal truck coming by. There was over $1,000 worth of clothes in that hamper. Tell me this is a sick joke. Tell me you hid it in your room. By now it must be compacted under tons of garbage at the county landfill. At that exact moment, the sound of the side door unlocking interrupted us. Jason walked into the house, wearing his grey logistics supervisor uniform, carrying his work backpack. He stopped at the end of the hall, surveying the scene with tired, alarmed eyes. "What's going on? Why are you screaming like that?" "Brittany, my son asked," dropping his backpack to the floor and running toward her. Brittany threw herself into his arms, sobbing with a theatricality that would have been comical if it weren't so pathetic. She buried her face in Jason's chest, pointing at me with a trembling finger over his shoulder. "Your mother is crazy, Jason. She has completely lost her mind," she screamed, choking on manufactured tears. She grabbed all my dirty laundry, my silk blouses, my jeans, my jackets, and threw them into the garbage truck. She left me with nothing. I told you her brain is gone, that she does things out of pure spite because she hates us. Look what she did." He stopped 3 feet away from me, invading my personal space, trying to use his height to intimidate me, just like he had watched his wife do so many times. "Mum, tell me this isn't true," Jason demanded, his voice tight, his fists clenched at his sides. "Did you seriously throw her clothes in the trash? What the hell is wrong with you? Brittany gave them to you to wash. We give you company, we take care of you, and you pull a stunt like this. You are going to have to pay her back for every single cent of what you threw away. You will take money out of your pension and buy her new clothes tomorrow morning." I saw nothing but a coward demanding my surrender to buy his own domestic peace. A perfect echo of the father who, at that very moment, was still hiding out in the garden. I am not paying a single cent, Jason, I said, my voice dropping an octave, turning heavy and dangerous. Your wife threw her dirty laundry in my face in front of strangers and told me that's why you give me a free roof over my head in this house. Maybe Brittany is right. Maybe you need a medical evaluation. Or maybe it's time I take total control of managing this house and you retire to get some rest. Brittany from the end of the hall nodded vigorously, wiping her tears, never taking her eyes filled with pure hatred off me. I let the silence settle in the living room. I let my son's threat bounce off the walls I built, let it seep into the furniture I upholstered. I slowly raised my right hand and rested it on the black leather of my purse, feeling the stiffness of the notary folder inside. My fingers brushed the edge of the flap. Jason expected an apology, the weeping of a frightened old woman, a plea for forgiveness so she wouldn't be shipped off to a nursing home or shoved into a dark corner under his new management. I gave him none of that. I offered a very slight smile, an imperceptible curve at the corner of my lips that never reached my eyes. Clear rules, I repeated, savouring my son's words, feeling the weight of the document that was about to change the course of history. You are absolutely right, Jason. We need very clear rules about who is putting a roof over whose head. I pressed my purse against my body, knowing the board had just been completely flipped, and took a step forward. I walked past him without brushing against him. My left shoulder was mere millimetres from Jason's puffed-out chest, but I didn't back down an inch, nor did I quicken my pace. The hardwood hallway creaked under my sensible shoes, keeping a steady, methodical rhythm identical to an industrial sewing machine, punching through layers of thick leather. Behind me, my son's stunned silence and my daughter-in-law's theatrical sobs crashed against my straight back. I felt Jason's hand reach out to grab my arm, a clumsy instinct for physical domination, but it froze in mid-air. The energy I was radiating in that moment was not that of a mother willing to negotiate, but of a landowner walking through her own domain. I kept my right hand gripping the strap of my purse, feeling through the black leather the stiffness of the manila envelope holding the notary document. That paper was the blade of the scissors. All that was left was to measure the fabric one last time before making the final cut. I reached my bedroom door. I turned the brass knob and stepped inside, locking it behind me. The metallic click echoed with absolute finality. The room was submerged in the bluish twilight of the evening. On the bed, under a woven wool blanket, Arthur was sleeping soundly, or at least faking it with the mastery of a man who has spent half a century running away from reality. The air smelled of his eucalyptus joint ointment, and the dust gathered in the heavy drapes that Brittany despised so much. I sat on the edge of the mattress without turning on the lamp. I took off my shoes slowly, feeling the dull throb in my swollen ankles. The adrenaline was starting to leave my bloodstream, leaving behind a mental clarity so frigid it almost hurt to breathe. I looked at my husband's motionless silhouette, and my mind drifted backward, pulled by the tide of memory. It was the winter of 1994. Jason was 17, and the whole world was too small for him. One Friday night, he sneaked out the neighbour's car, an old sedan the man used to make a living as a cab driver, and crashed it into a light pole 3 blocks from here. The neighbour, a desperate and furious man, threatened to call the cops and ruin my son's life if we didn't pay for the damages immediately. Arthur, true to his nature, locked himself in the bathroom to cry, wailing that we were ruined. I was the one who went down to the upholstery shop that very dawn. I was the one who took on an urgent, underpaid job to reupholster all the booths for a roadside diner. I remember the pungent smell of industrial glue, the reddish dust from the polyurethane foam floating in the basement air. I worked for 72 hours straight. My fingers split open, the curved needle drove right through the pad of my right thumb, leaving a dark bloodstain on the red vinyl of one of the seats. I paid off Jason's debt, bill by bill. When I handed him the receipt from the mechanic's shop, my son didn't even say thank you. He just grabbed his jacket and went to play soccer with his friends, relieved that his stupidity had no consequences. At the time, I thought I was protecting him. That sacrifice was the ultimate expression of a mother's love. Today, sitting in the dark of my bedroom, I understood the magnitude of my mistake. Blind love doesn't raise strong men. It manufactures cowardly tyrants. I taught Jason that there would always be someone willing to bleed to clean up his messes. And now he expected me to keep bleeding to keep his wife's fantasy intact. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the armchair by the window, watching the darkness slowly dissolve into the grey tones of dawn. At 7 in the morning, I heard noises in the kitchen, hurried footsteps, the clinking of coffee mugs, tense whispers. Jason hadn't gone to work. I put on my clean apron, combed my grey hair back into a tight bun at the nape of my neck, grabbed my purse with the document inside, and walked out into the hall. Stepping into the kitchen, the scene that greeted me confirmed my suspicions that Jason had decided to execute his threat from the night before. Sitting at the head of my oak table, holding a steaming mug of tea, was a woman in her 50s wearing an impeccable tailored suit and wire-rimmed glasses. On the table in front of her sat a leather briefcase and an open notepad. Jason was standing by the fridge, arms crossed and scowling, while Brittany remained seated next to the stranger, rubbing her eyes with a tissue in a pathetic attempt to fake crying. Mum, Jason said the second I crossed the threshold, his voice dripping with a fake compassion that turned my stomach. I'm so glad you're up. This is Dr. Elena Hayes. She is a psychiatrist specialising in geriatrics. I asked her to come see you because of the incident with the laundry yesterday. She was looking at me with dead eyes, like she didn't even recognise me. Living like this is torture. We are terrified that one day she'll leave the gas on or hurt Arthur. With a diagnosis of senile dementia, he could initiate a legal guardianship process, have me declared incompetent to manage my own assets, and consequently seize absolute control of the house. It was a coup d'etat, executed out of cowardice, weaponizing medicine. I walked over to the coffee maker, grabbed my white ceramic mug and poured myself some black coffee. My hands didn't shake. The dark liquid fell in a perfect, silent stream. I turned around, leaned my hip against the counter, and looked the psychiatrist right in the eyes. Dr. Hayes. I finally spoke, my voice ringing out, clear, steady, and stripped of any emotional tremor. I understand your position. You were called in on an emergency, paid for a house call, and fed a family tragedy. If you'd like, you can run whatever cognitive tests you deem necessary. Have me count backward from 100 by sevens. Ask me to memorize 3 words. Ask me who the President of the United States is, or what year it is. I am entirely at your disposal. But first, I suggest you ask my son and my daughter-in-law to leave my kitchen. Medical evaluations require privacy, don't they? She looked at Jason, then at Brittany, and finally nodded slowly. You are absolutely right, Mrs. Doris, the psychiatrist said, clicking her pen shut. Jason, Brittany, please wait for us in the living room. I need to speak privately with your mother. Please step out, the doctor ordered, this time with a firmness that left no room for argument. Jason clenched his jaw, glaring daggers at me, and marched out of the kitchen, dragging Brittany by the elbow. I heard their footsteps fade down the hall toward the living room. Once silence reigned in the room again, I walked over to the table and sat in the chair across from Dr. Hayes. I placed my leather purse on my lap. All right, Mrs. Doris, the psychiatrist began opening her notepad. Do you know what day it is today? You are here because my son, Jason, who works as a logistics route supervisor and has a track record of financial failures, desperately needs a legal excuse to strip me of my property. And regarding the laundry incident yesterday, there was no disorientation. Your daughter-in-law claims I threw away clean, expensive clothes for no reason. Yesterday afternoon, in front of 2 of her friends, she pulled a makeup-stained silk blouse, a pair of sweatpants reeking of stale sweat, and a pair of dirty socks out of a hamper. She threw the bundle straight at my chest and ordered me to wash it right then, adding verbatim the phrase, "That's why we give you a free roof over your head in this house." I didn't scream, I didn't cry, and I didn't lose my memory. I simply picked up the clothes, walked to the laundry room, and stuffed absolutely every single garment she had hoarded into 2 heavy-duty black industrial trash bags. I dragged them to the curb and waited patiently for the municipal garbage truck to roll by at 4:40 in the afternoon. I watched the machine shred the clothes. It was a deliberate, calculated, and fully conscious act of deep cleaning. I sleep as much as I need to. I eat what I cook myself because my daughter-in-law only orders takeout and leaves the dirty containers on this very table for me to clean up, I replied, unzipping my purse. I pulled out a small black notebook, my meticulous ledger of the last 2 years. I slid it across the table into the doctor's hands. There are the accounts, Dr. Hayes, dates, amounts, invoice numbers. For a year and a half, I have been paying 100% of the electricity, water, gas, and internet for this house out of my retirement pension. My son and my daughter-in-law do not contribute a single cent, yet they receive online shopping packages weekly. Jason makes enough to rent an apartment, but Brittany prefers to live here, treating me like her unpaid live-in maid because it allows her to maintain a lifestyle they can't afford. I am not crazy, doctor. I have simply stopped being docile. She reviewed the receipts stapled to the back pages. The silence in the kitchen grew thick, loaded with the crushing weight of the evidence. The doctor closed the notebook and handed it back to me. There was a mix of respect and pity in her eyes, the kind of expression a professional reserves for the survivors of a prolonged shipwreck. Mrs. Doris, the psychiatrist, said, snapping her own briefcase shut, "You have an enviable lucidity. Your orientation to time, space, and person is flawless. Your short and long-term memory is intact, and your capacity for judgment and reasoning is superior to that of most people your age. What you are suffering from is not dementia. It is financial and psychological abuse. That is why I am taking action. I will charge them the maximum rate for an unjustified house call. And if you ever need medical testimony for a legal proceeding, my card is on the table." The notary's office was downtown, a gloomy place that smelled of dark tobacco and damp paper. The clatter of mechanical typewriters filled the air. Arthur was sitting next to me, his work boots covered in sawdust staining the marble floor. His hands were shaking. That very day at the lumberyard, a bandsaw had snapped, amputating 3 of the foreman's fingers right in front of his eyes. The terror of death, of sudden disability, had shattered whatever little faith Arthur had in the future. When the notary pushed the deed for the land we had just bought across the desk, Arthur backed away. "Put it all in her name," my husband said, his voice cracking. "Only in Doris's name. If the saw takes my hand, the mill's lawyers will strip us of everything to avoid paying a pension. Let the house be yours, Doris, only yours. That way, no one can touch it." I picked up the pen. My signature was firm, dark, absolute. Arthur's cowardice, his pathological fear of conflict and disaster, was paradoxically what handed me the most impenetrable legal shield a woman of my generation could ever wish for. He did it out of fear. I accepted it as a blood pact. A pact that my son, in his arrogance, was completely oblivious to. Dr. Hayes stood up, tore the receipt from her pad, and walked toward the kitchen door. I followed a few steps behind. Reaching the hallway, Jason and Brittany sprang up from the living room sofa, with expressions of anxious expectation. Jason rushed over, reaching out his hand, to receive what he believed was my civil death sentence. "Well, doctor," my son asked, trying to sound distressed, "how bad is the progression of the dementia?" "We need to institutionalize her. Using psychiatric emergency services to attempt to incapacitate a family member over cohabitation conflicts is a severe ethical violation. My fee for this visit is $200. I suggest you transfer it to me before noon. Good day." His eyes scanned the lines written by the doctor, and I watched the blood drain from his face, quickly replaced by a red flush of fury creeping up his neck. Brittany, peeking over his shoulder, read the certificate and clenched her fists at her sides. Their master plan had crumbled in less than 20 minutes. If she's not crazy, then she did it out of pure spite, Brittany hissed, her voice trembling with rage, instantly dropping the role of the concerned daughter-in-law.
I told you, Jason, she's a bitter old hag who hates me. She threw my clothes in the trash, knowing exactly what she was doing. She humiliated me on purpose.
There was no trace left of the son I had once cradled. Standing in front of me was nothing but a man cornered by his own mediocrity, desperate to assert dominance.
All right, Mum.
If you want to play lucid and start a war in this house, we are going to play by my rules, Jason declared, pointing his index finger barely an inch from my nose. From this moment on, things change. Since you're so healthy, you can start packing your things. This Sunday, Brittany's parents are coming for dinner. They're driving in from out of town, and they're going to stay for a couple of weeks to help us get on our feet financially. We are going to give them your room, the master suite. You are going to move into the sewing room in the back. It's small, but it's enough for you. We are taking over the management of this house because clearly you don't know how to live with family. You have until Sunday morning to empty your closets. If you don't do it, I will, and I'll throw your stuff in the yard. Understood. They wanted to banish me from my own bedroom, the room I shared with my husband for 40 years, to install Brittany's parents as the new monarchs of the conquered territory. It was the final nail in the coffin, the absolute confirmation that to Jason, I was no longer a mother, but a physical obstacle that needed to be removed and confined to a dark corner. As I listened to him dictate my exile, the third memory hit me with the force of a bullwhip. It was the night they arrived at my door seeking shelter. The torrential rain hammered the living room windows. Brittany was soaked, shivering, clutching her designer suitcase. Jason was crying at the kitchen table. "It will only be for a few months, Mum," he had said. "I swear we won't be a burden. We will respect your space, your routine. We just need a place to crash until the storm passes. We are begging you."
And Brittany, looking at me with the eyes of a slaughtered lamb, had added,
"You are an angel, Miss Doris. We will never forget this. This is your house, and we will be invisible." I looked at my son's index finger threatening me. Then I looked at Brittany, who was smiling with superiority from the end of the hall, believing that her husband's brute force had finally broken me. I didn't move a single muscle in my face. I showed no pain, no outrage, no fear. Slowly, with the same methodical pacing I used to thread a needle in the shop, I nodded. Sunday, I repeated my voice, sounding hollow and accommodating a velvet trap over a pit of spikes. That sounds like an excellent day to make permanent changes to the management of the house. Don't worry, Jason. By the time lunch is served on Sunday, everything will be exactly where it belongs. We want them to feel like they own the place. I polished the hardwood floors until they caught the sunlight like mirrors. I washed the living room curtains. I vacuumed every corner. I waxed the dining room table. Jason and Brittany watched me from the periphery, smirking smugly. Assuming my cleaning frenzy was the acceptance of my new role as the permanent maid for their extended family. Arthur, sensing the electrical tension in the air, spent the entire weekend locked in the tool shed, fleeing the impending cataclysm. Sunday morning, I woke up at dawn. I prepared the largest, most expensive rack of short ribs I could buy at the neighbourhood butcher shop. I chopped garlic, onions, and bell peppers, whipping up a marinade that filled the house with a thick, festive aroma. I tossed fresh salads, baked homemade bread, and pulled out my best porcelain dinnerware, the set I kept strictly for Christmas. I set the dining table with a white linen tablecloth, aligning the silver cutlery with millimetre precision. In the centre of the table, right next to the main platter for the smoking meat, I placed a small, empty wicker bread basket. At 12:30 p.m, I walked to my bedroom. I opened my leather purse. I pulled out the manila envelope containing the 3 original copies of the notarized eviction notice, signed, sealed, and dated by Harrison Vance, stipulating the strict, non-negotiable 30-day legal deadline for Jason and Brittany to vacate my property due to the revocation of their tenancy at will. The paper felt heavy, loaded with the force of 40 years of sweat and scars. I folded the envelope in half and slipped it into the deep front pocket of my white apron, pressing it against my stomach. The front doorbell rang at exactly 1 o'clock. I heard Brittany's high-pitched squeals of excitement running down the hall, the sound of the deadbolt clicking open, and the booming voices of her parents flooding the entryway.
"Oh, what a gorgeous house, honey," exclaimed the raspy voice of Brittany's mother. "Jason told me you guys have finally taken control of all this. It's about time you got the space you deserve."
I took a deep breath, savouring the smell of roasted meat and betrayal, and walked slowly toward the dining room, ready to serve them the main course. The aroma of roasted meat, crispy garlic and rosemary flooded the room instantly, mingling with the sickeningly sweet perfume Brittany's mother had dragged in with her. The scene unfolding around my oak table, the very table I had bought second-hand and restored, sanding the wood down until my fingerprints nearly vanished, was the literal depiction of a completed invasion. Robert, my daughter-in-law's father, had installed himself at the head of the table, the chair Arthur had occupied for 40 years. He was a bulky, red-faced man with a booming voice, wearing an overly flashy gold watch on his left wrist. To his right sat Connie, his wife, a woman who shared Brittany's desperate need to project a status she didn't possess, draped in heavy costume jewellery and sporting hair stiff with hairspray. Jason and Brittany took the side seats, smiling, with the complacency of two monarchs who have just presented their kingdom to the visiting court. No one stood up to help me with the £10 platter. No one made the gesture of moving the crystal glasses to make room for me. I walked with my back straight, my sensible shoes muffling the sound of my steps on the polished wood, and set the steaming meat right in the centre of the white linen tablecloth, next to the wicker bread basket I had intentionally left empty. "Wow, smells pretty good," Robert commented, leaning over the table to inhale the steam from the meat, without even tossing a glance my way. "Jason told me the home cooking here was a bit basic, but this looks great." "Hand me the big knife, son-in-law. I'll handle the carving." In my house, the man of the family always serves the meat. Pour the red wine I bought last week, the black label one. I didn't alter the expression on my face. I simply turned around and walked toward the kitchen. As I uncorked the bottle of wine on the counter, the echo of their conversation drifted to my ears with an insulting clarity. "It is a fantastic property, Jason. I really congratulate you," Robert's raspy voice boomed. "Brittany mentioned you guys made a smart investment holding onto this house, but I didn't picture the layout being this spacious. With a good remodel, this will be worth a fortune in a couple of years. You've got to modernise it, though. That dark wood is so out of style." Jason and I were talking about knocking down the wall between the living room and the hallway to do an open concept. And, well, now that you guys are here, we are going to start by fixing up the master bedroom. The natural light coming through that big window is perfect for you, Mum. Jason already decided that you guys will take that room for as long as you need. It is the absolute least we can do to make you comfortable while you help us with the kids when we decide to have them. At her age, sometimes old folks get too attached to their things. Plus, it is time for us, the ones bringing the vitality and the future to this family, to take the reins of the management. She just needs to rest and, well, help us out with the light kitchen chores. Like today. The weight of the manila envelope in my apron pocket was a cold anchor against my stomach, keeping me grounded in reality while they floated in their bubble of lies. I started pouring the wine into the glasses. First Robert, then Connie. The dark red liquid fell with a steady, liquid sound, staining the pristine crystal. The lie they had spun was colossal. Jason and Brittany hadn't just hijacked my house in practice. They had built an entire narrative for their guests. They had made them believe that they were the owners, the providers, the magnanimous benefactors who allowed Jason's elderly mother to live under their roof out of pure charity. They had erased my 40 years of labour. They had hidden my pension that paid for the lights illuminating them and the water they drank. And they had reduced me to the role of a domestic burden who should be grateful for the scraps of their supposed generosity. "Thank you, Doris." "Can you leave the bottle there?" Connie told me, raising her hand without making eye contact, using that condescending tone pretentious women reserve for the hired help. "And please make sure the guest bathroom has fresh towels. After we eat, I'd like to freshen up a bit." Robert had already sliced the meat and was plating generous portions onto the porcelain dishes. The fat sizzled faintly. The banquet was at its peak of opulence, a feast funded out of my own pocket to celebrate my own banishment.
I stood a few feet from the table, my hands clasped over my apron.
Jason picked up his fork, but before stabbing the first piece of meat, he turned to me. The moment he considered the climax of his victory had arrived, his official coronation in front of his new court. "All right, Mum." Jason began dabbing the corner of his mouth with the linen napkin. "Since we are all gathered here, and as we agreed on Friday, I think this is the perfect time to formalise the changes. My in-laws are tired from the drive and they're going to want to settle into the master bedroom after lunch to rest. I want you to give me the keys to your room right now and tell me you already cleared your stuff out of the closets, because I don't want Brittany having to deal with your old clothes this afternoon." Robert and Connie looked at me, expecting to see the submission of the defeated old woman handing over the keys to her castle. Brittany smirked from behind her wine glass, her eyes gleaming with a victorious malice. She was relishing every second of my public humiliation, savouring the revenge for the clothes the garbage truck had shredded 3 days ago. I didn't move. I kept my breathing steady, feeling the constant thrum of my heartbeat echoing in my ears. I slowly slid my right hand into the deep front pocket of my white apron. My calloused fingers, used to finding a needle in the dark, brushed the edge of the manila envelope. "Did you not hear me, Mum?" Jason insisted, raising his voice, his tone taking on an edge of aggressive impatience. His authority was being questioned in front of his audience, and his fragile ego couldn't tolerate the delay. "I asked you for the keys to the master bedroom. Give them to me right now, and I am not handing over my bedroom. Do you want to make a scene in front of my in-laws? Do you want me to call Dr. Hayes again and tell her you had another psychotic episode? I told you the changes were happening today, and in this house, what I say goes. You have been living under an illusion so deep, you ended up believing your own lie. And what's worse, you dragged your guests right into that same fantasy." I pulled out the 3 copies of the notarized notice, perfectly stapled, stamped with Harrison Vance's blue letterhead, and bearing my signature on the final page. I took the first copy and with a firm flick of the wrist, slid it across the linen tablecloth, stopping it right next to Jason's plate. I took the second and placed it in front of Brittany. The third I kept in my hand. "What is this?" Jason stammered, looking down at the document. "A list of complaints. An inventory. Mum, I am not in the mood for your passive-aggressive games." I watched the arrogance drain from his features, instantly replaced by a deathly pallor. His pupils dilated. His hands started to shake, making the heavy paper produce a vibrating, pathetic sound. This is a forgery." My son stuttered his voice, losing all the artificial gravity he had faked minutes earlier. "This has no legal standing. It's just some paper printed off the internet." As his eyes tracked down the legal paragraphs, his face went from confusion to disbelief, and finally to a dark, silent fury. "Can someone explain to me what this means?" Robert demanded, slapping the paper against the table with the back of his hand. His raspy voice boomed off the walls. He looked at Jason, then at Brittany. "It says right here, Notice of Revocation of Tenancy at Will. It says, Citizen Doris Carmen Vance is the sole and exclusive owner of this property, and that she grants a non-negotiable 30-day legal deadline for the occupants Jason Vance and Brittany Rojas to vacate the premises." "What is this garbage, Jason? You told me this house was yours. You told me you bought it 3 years ago." He spun toward me with bulging eyes, baring his teeth in a grimace of aggressive desperation. "You're crazy. You and my dad bought this house together. It's a marital asset. I have inheritance rights. You can't throw me out on the street with some cheap lawyer's paper." The pity had completely vanished, leaving only the cold determination of justice. "Your father, in a panic attack 30 years ago, insisted the deed be put solely in my name to protect the asset from potential workplace lawsuits," I explained, my voice ringing clear and methodical, addressing not just Jason, but Brittany's parents. "In the eyes of the law, this dirt, these bricks, and this roof belong exclusively to me.
You have no inheritance rights because I am not dead, and you have no squatter's rights because we never signed a lease. You have lived here under my tolerance, a tolerance that has just expired. You made me tell the whole family you married a successful businessman who bought you a mansion, and it turns out you're living like freeloaders in your mother-in-law's house. What a humiliation, Brittany. What a disgrace. They were sobs of genuine panic. The raw reaction of a narcissistic person whose greatest fear being exposed in front of her social circle had just materialised in the most brutal way possible. "It is her fault," Mum Brittany shrieked, pointing at me with shaking hands. "She's a selfish old hag who hates us. She's throwing us on the street out of pure revenge just because I didn't want to clean the kitchen a couple of times. I am throwing you out because you turned my house into a dumpster while pretending to be rich for your friends. And I am throwing you out because you let my son believe he could rob me of my peace and my dignity. I am very sorry you were dragged into this charade. You came here believing you were taking control of a house that belonged to your son-in-law. The reality is your son-in-law doesn't even own the silverware he was about to eat with. He makes enough to rent an apartment, but you chose to live here, like parasites, to fund the lifestyle your daughter demands and that he cannot afford." "Shut your mouth," Jason roared, stopping barely a foot away from me. "I will not let you humiliate me in my own house. I will rip that paper into 1,000 pieces and lock you in that sewing room until you rot. You are not throwing me on the street. Do you hear me? I am your son." I simply looked him dead in the eyes, using silence as the deadliest weapon a disappointed mother can wield. I felt the tension in the air, the panic of Connie screaming her son-in-law's name, the ragged breathing of Brittany. Jason had his fist clenched, shaking in the air, but the dead cold, unbreakable stare I shot back paralysed him. He knew in the deepest depths of his cowardice that if he laid a hand on me, the cops would drag him out in handcuffs before nightfall. Slowly, Jason lowered his arm, his shoulders slumping. The fury gave way to the crushing realisation of his own impotence. He had no money for a legal battle. He didn't have the support of his father, who was still hiding in some corner of the yard. And now he had lost the respect of his in-laws. I folded the third copy of the notice, the one I had kept in my hand, and carefully tucked it into the front breast pocket of his work uniform, smoothing the fabric over his chest with 2 sharp final pats. "On Thursday afternoon, in front of your friends," I started to say, slowly turning my head to lock eyes with Brittany, who shrank in her chair as if my words carried physical weight. "You threw a stained blouse and stinking pants in my face. You demanded I wash them right away, and you told me, with an arrogance I won't forget as long as I live, that's why you give me a free roof over my head in this house, so I could at least be useful for something." Connie covered her face with her hands. I returned my attention to Jason, who was staring at the paper sticking out of his pocket like it was a death sentence. "The irony, Jason, is that she had the right concept but the wrong recipient," I whispered, my voice loaded with an absolute finality that echoed in the deathly silence of the room. "That is why I gave you a free roof over your heads for 2 years, so you could at least learn to respect the person feeding you. But since you didn't learn, the roof is gone. If on the 31st there is a single shoe of yours left on this property, Mr. Vance will show up with a police cruiser and a court-ordered eviction, and I will personally haul your things out to the street in black industrial trash bags." The front doorbell rang for the second time, a sharp, prolonged beep that cut through the sepulchral silence of the dining room, like the whistle of a train about to derail. No one in the room moved a muscle. Jason stood petrified, his eyes locked on the notarized notice poking out of the pocket of his uniform. Brittany trembled in her chair, her face stained by the tears of her own exposed lie, while her parents, Robert and Connie, breathed with the heaviness of people who have just discovered the ground beneath their feet was made of rotting cardboard. The rack of short ribs, smoking and perfect in the centre of the table, was starting to cool. The fat sizzled with less and less force. I turned around, turning my back to them with the exact same calm with which I would walk away from a finished piece of furniture,
and walked down the hardwood hallway toward the entryway. My sensible shoes kept a steady beat. I opened the front door. On the porch, taking shelter from the midday sun, stood a young man in a navy blue uniform, holding a rectangular cardboard box with the black and gold logo of one of the most expensive boutiques from the downtown mall. The kid wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his free hand and held out a digital tablet. "Good afternoon. Rush delivery with cash on delivery for Mrs. Brittany Rojas," the delivery driver announced, dragging his words with the typical exhaustion of someone who has been driving for hours in the sun. "That's $480.50. It can be cash or card, but the reader is acting up a bit, so I prefer cash if you have it." I heard the screech of a wooden chair being shoved violently backward. Brittany appeared in the threshold of the hallway, pale as plaster, frantically wiping her cheeks with her hands. Behind her, her father's massive figure peeked out, followed by Jason's shrunken shadow. I didn't ask for it to be delivered today," Brittany stammered, shuffling awkwardly toward the door, trying to block the delivery guy's view into the house. "I thought the charge already went through on the credit card online. There must be a glitch in the store's system. The label clearly states your card was declined 3 times last night for insufficient funds, and you selected the cash on delivery option this morning so you wouldn't lose the hold on the order. It's a pair of designer shoes and a handbag, according to the manifest. Are you going to pay, or do I return the package to the warehouse?" She turned slowly toward Jason with that look of manipulative begging that had worked for her for years. "Baby, my card is maxed out. Can you cover it? It's the outfit I need for my parents' anniversary dinner next week. I'll pay you back when I get paid, I promise." The man had just been served his imminent eviction notice. His father-in-law had just discovered his absolute moral and financial bankruptcy, and his wife, right in the middle of the apocalypse, was asking him for almost $500 for a pair of shoes. "I don't have that money," Brittany Jason whispered, his voice cracking, stripped of every ounce of the bragging authority he had paraded minutes earlier over the roast. "I have absolutely nothing in the account, you know that perfectly well. Give it a rest for a few days. I swear to God, I am not giving you a single cent for your rags." I pulled the front door shut with a soft, definitive click. The silence that settled in the entryway was thick, suffocating, loaded with a humiliation so pure you could almost taste it in the air. Robert looked Jason up and down, scrutinizing his grey logistics supervisor uniform, his eyes landing on the manila envelope sticking out of his breast pocket. The contempt in the older man's eyes was absolute. He was stripping my son of his manhood, his dignity, and his status in a matter of seconds. Connie, Robert called out without taking his eyes off Jason. Brittany's mother appeared trembling in the hallway, clutching her purse to her chest. "Go up to that guest room, pack our things, and call a cab. We are going to a hotel downtown. I am not spending another minute under this lady's roof eating the meat she paid for while my daughter and her husband play pretend millionaires off an old woman's pension. Jason is getting a promotion soon. We are going to buy our own house." I swear they didn't speak a word to me, not because they hated me, but because the guilt and second-hand embarrassment made it physically impossible for them to look me in the eye. Jason and Brittany stood in the entryway alone, surrounded by the echo of their own lies, watching the taxi drive away down the tree-lined street. I didn't stick around to witness the morning. I walked back to the dining room. I sat in my chair, picked up the carving knife, sliced a perfect cut of the short ribs that still held a bit of heat, and served myself a generous spoonful of fresh salad. I ate in silence, chewing slowly, savouring the garlic and rosemary. From the hallway, the screaming began. The venomous accusations, the muffled insults, the sound of something plastic shattering against a wall. Jason blamed Brittany for her reckless spending. Brittany blamed Jason for being a loser, incapable of defending her. The civil war had broken out in the enemy trenches. I poured myself half a glass of the Black Label red wine. I toasted in silence to the empty chair at the head of the table and took a sip. The real siege began the next day, a 30-day siege, where my only weapon was the relentless rigour of routine. First thing Monday morning, I called the cable company. I requested the immediate cancellation of the premium television package and ordered a password change for the Wi-Fi network. The router, which until then sat on a table in the hallway, was unplugged, moved to my bedroom and locked away. When Brittany woke up at noon and discovered she couldn't upload photos to her social media or stream her TV shows on data, she stormed down to the kitchen, demanding answers. I didn't answer her. I kept whisking my eggs for breakfast. Her tantrum bounced off my back like stones against a concrete wall. On Tuesday, I bought a heavy-duty forged steel padlock and installed it on the door of the large kitchen pantry where I kept my non-perishable groceries, my olive oils, my whole bean coffee, and my homemade jams. In the refrigerator, I emptied the top 2 shelves, removing my fresh vegetables, my lean meats, and my dairy. I relocated them to a small mini fridge Arthur used to keep in his workshop years ago, which I'd hauled up to my room. On the empty kitchen shelves, I carefully arranged Brittany's half-eaten pizza boxes, the sticky Asian takeout containers, and a carton of sour milk she had left out the night before. On Wednesday, Jason tried to confront me. He cornered me in the laundry room while I was prepping a load of whites. His face was gaunt, carved with deep bags under his eyes, and his uniform smelled of stale cigarette smoke, a vice he had picked back up out of anxiety. "What are you trying to prove with this, Mum?" my son hissed, gripping the edge of the white plastic washing machine. "You cut off our internet. You locked up the food. Brittany is having panic attacks in the bedroom because she can't talk to her friends. Do you enjoy torturing us? Do you feel powerful with that notary paper? I simply stopped financing the lifestyle you should be paying for your wife. If Brittany wants internet, you can get her a data plan on her phone. If you want to eat fresh food, the grocery store is 4 blocks away and it's open until 10 at night. You demanded to manage your own lives. I am simply giving you the absolute freedom to do it with your own money. And I'll remind you, you have 27 days left." Brittany had to start washing her own clothes by hand in the bathroom sink, terrified of going near the laundry room, for fear her garments would magically vanish into heavy-duty trash bags again. I saw her one afternoon drying some cheap blouses by hanging them on the doorknobs, her hands with their ruined manicures shaking with frustration. Her friends from the social club stopped coming around. The rumour of her humiliation in front of her parents had spread with the speed of a wildfire in dry brush. The illusion of the wealthy, self-sacrificing young woman had disintegrated, leaving in its place a woman trapped in the misery of her own arrogance. It was in the second week when Arthur, my husband, finally decided to emerge from his shell of cowardice. He had spent the last 14 days hiding in the tool shed at the back of the garden, listening to his soccer games on the portable radio, dining on cold sandwiches I left for him on the back windowsill to avoid him crossing paths with our son. But the tension was unbearable, even for him. One Tuesday night, while I was sewing a tear in a curtain hem at the dining room table, Arthur shuffled over in his worn-out slippers, sat in the chair across from me, turned off his hearing aid, and looked at me with those watery, pleading eyes he always used when he wanted me to fix the chaos he enabled. "Doris," Arthur muttered, scratching his patchy grey beard. "That's enough, don't you think? Jason is suffering a lot. I hear him crying on the patio in the early hours of the morning. That girl Brittany, she's as pale as a ghost. They are family, Doris. Blood pulls you in. You can't just throw them out on the street like stray dogs. Tell them they can stay. Give them rules if you want, but don't break the family apart. I don't want to live in a house where my own son hates me." The black cotton thread drew a perfectly straight line under the lamp. I looked at the man I had shared a bed with for 4.5 decades. The man who had left me alone in every trench, in every financial crisis, in every parenting battle. You surrendered your family the day you put those headphones on, so you wouldn't have to hear your daughter-in-law's insults. Arthur. I told him, my voice, stripped of rage, loaded only with a cold, immovable truth. You broke Jason when you taught him that ducking his head and hiding was how to be a man. This house is mine. I built it, I maintain it, and I decide who breathes under this roof. Jason and Brittany leave on the 30th. There is no negotiation. There is no magical forgiveness. If their leaving hurts you so much, pack your bags and go with them. I give you the exact same freedom I gave him.
But if you choose to stay in my house, you will abide by my rules. And the first rule is that not a single tear will be shed in here for those who tried to destroy us. The remaining days burned down like the tobacco in Jason's cigarettes, fast, toxic, and leaving a trail of ash on the floor. On day 28, they started packing. They didn't hire a professional moving company. They obviously had no credit. Jason scrounged up used cardboard boxes from the corner grocery store. The sound of packing tape ripping and sticking echoed down the hallways for 48 hours straight. The morning of the 30th dawned cloudy, with a cold breeze signalling the end of autumn. At exactly 9 o'clock, a rusted flatbed truck, likely borrowed from one of Jason's co-workers, parked at my curb. I sat in the dark green velvet armchair in the living room, with a mug of black coffee in my hands, and watched the parade of defeat. Jason carried the heavy boxes, his muscles shaking from the effort, his face dripping with cold sweat. He didn't look at me. He walked past the living room with his head down, dragging his feet. Brittany carried the light items, her bedside lamps, her shiny plastic knickknacks that I hated so much, her fashion magazines. The poetic irony of the day materialized when I saw her walk out the front door, carrying the rest of her clothes. Since they hadn't been able to buy wardrobe boxes, Brittany was carrying her sweaters and dresses stuffed into massive black plastic bags. Industrial trash bags. The exact same kind I had used to feed the garbage compactor. She walked right past me, dragging the plastic across the hardwood floor. Her eyes locked on the open door, fleeing my presence, as if I were a contagious plague. By 11:30, the guest room was empty. All that was left was the dust gathered behind the furniture they never bothered to clean. Jason stopped in the threshold of the front door. He was dirty, exhausted, and defeated. He held the keys to my house in his right hand. He stared at them for a second, pressed his lips into a tight line, and walked toward the living room. He stopped 6 feet from my armchair, dropping the keychain onto the oak coffee table. The metal clattered with a sharp jingle. "Here are your damn keys," Jason said, his raspy voice scraping the bottom of his shattered prize. "Are you happy, Mum? Are you proud of what you did? You won. You threw us on the street. We are moving into a 2-bedroom apartment on the south side of town, right next to a noisy avenue, because that's all I could afford the deposit for. You destroyed your own blood over some clothes and your pride." "I didn't play a game, Jason. Therefore, I didn't win anything," I replied, lowering my mug to its ceramic saucer. "And I didn't destroy my blood. You destroyed yourself the day you let your wife throw her filth in my face while you applauded her. The street you are heading to was paved by you, with every electric bill you refused to pay. Leave now and shut the door gently. I just oiled the hinges." He turned around, walked down the hall, stepped out onto the porch, and pulled the heavy oak door shut. The click of the lock was the most beautiful sound I had heard in 2 years. I got up from the armchair, walked to the front door, and slid the manual deadbolt into place. Then I went to the kitchen, grabbed a bucket, filled it with hot water and pine-scented cleaner, and spent the next 5 hours scrubbing the hardwood floors of the entire house, literally erasing the footprints of their shoes, purifying the air, reclaiming every single square inch of my territory. 6 months later, spring had brought the colour back to the rose garden. The house was breathing again. I had thrown out the living room rug that harboured the smell of Brittany's sickly sweet perfume, leaving the wood bare and shining. My potted ferns and African violets had made a triumphant return from their exile on the patio, reclaiming the sunlit corners of the hallway and the side tables. Arthur still lived here, of course, but he had morphed into a silent, docile ghost. He spent his days tending the garden, cleaning the gutters, speaking in a low voice, and making absolutely sure he didn't mess up the kitchen. The balance of power had been reset with the force of a hammer strike. It was a Thursday afternoon, almost 4:40. I was sweeping the sidewalk in front of my house, gathering the dry flowers the wind had torn from the trees. The roar of the municipal garbage truck's diesel engine announced its arrival from the corner. The massive white and green vehicle hissed to a halt in front of me. Mac, the broad-shouldered garbage man, hopped down onto the street. He had a bright smile and a face beaded with sweat. I handed him a plastic cup filled with
ice-cold lemonade I had made for him. "Good afternoon, Miss Doris Mack," greeted me, accepting the cup gratefully and downing half of it in a single gulp. "Your front yard looks beautiful. You can really tell the house is at peace." He looked up and down the street before lowering his voice a little, slipping into that tone of neighbourhood confidentiality that binds working-class people together. "Listen, I don't know if I should tell you this, but I saw your boy last week," Mac told me, with a look of genuine pity. "They switched our route for a couple of days, over to the old apartment complexes on the south side. I saw him coming out of one of those grey buildings with the water-stained walls. He was in a dirty uniform, walking toward the bus stop. And his wife, Mrs. Brittany, I saw her working the cash register at the discount pharmacy on that same block. She was wearing the neon green uniform vest. She was screaming at a customer over some expired coupons. They looked really tired, Miss Doris." The image of Brittany the woman who demanded sushi platters and humiliated old women in front of her rich friends, trapped behind a cash register fighting over discount coupons. It didn't bring me joy or a sense of triumph or remorse. It brought me the exact same feeling I had when the truck shredded her silk blouse. The absolute tranquility that the math of the universe is exact and the debt had been paid in full. "Everyone builds the roof they decide to live under, Mac," I told him, taking the empty cup from his hands. "Have a good root." In the centre of the room, resting on two wooden sawhorses, sat an antique dining chair I had bought at a flea market that very morning. The mahogany wood was scratched. The seat was caved in, and the original fabric was rotting away. It was a disaster. It was perfect. I walked over to my toolbox, pulled out my pliers, my upholstery hammer, and my staple gun. I ran my calloused fingers, covered in old scars, over the edge of the damaged wood. I took the new fabric, a tough, thick, unbleached canvas, and stretched it tight over the fresh foam. I pressed the nose of the staple gun against the wood, calculating the perfect angle. I took a deep breath in the absolute silence of my own house, and I pulled the trigger. The metallic crack rang out loud, firm, and final, driving the staple exactly where I wanted it to be. Reflection and life lessons for a better life. Listening to Doris's harrowing yet deeply triumphant journey offers us a profound opportunity for personal reflection, reminding us that this story is created solely for educational purposes, to help us cultivate a better, more intentional life. At its absolute core, this narrative exposes the hidden, destructive dangers of enabling entitlement under the guise of maternal love, teaching us that setting firm, non-negotiable boundaries is never an act of cruelty, but a vital preservation of our own human dignity. So often in our daily lives, we mistake silent endurance for patience, allowing toxic interpersonal dynamics to slowly erode the very spaces, peace and stability we worked so hard for decades to build. Doris's experience vividly demonstrates to listeners that unconditional love should never be equated with the unconditional tolerance of disrespect, especially from the very people we have sacrificed our own comfort to protect. To live a better, happier, and more fulfilling life, we must realize that true self-worth is never passive. It requires us to stand tall and completely reclaim our own narrative when our boundaries are shamelessly crossed. When we constantly shield the people we care about from the natural, harsh consequences of their actions, we inadvertently strip them of their own moral growth, maturity, and personal accountability. By taking a deliberate step back and executing a calculated path toward absolute justice, Doris didn't just save her physical home, she successfully forced her family to face reality and discover the true value of honest labour. Let this serve as a powerful, resonant reminder to deeply examine your own relationships, to speak up courageously before resentment hardens into ice, and to always remember that you are the sole designer of your own destiny. True human value is built through mutual respect, and a better life begins when we refuse to let others treat our kindness as weakness. Personalized, humanistic commentary. From my perspective, Doris's story holds up a stark mirror to the quiet entitlement that can easily fester within modern family dynamics. It forces us to confront how fluidly toxic behavior can disguise itself as a cry for help, while slowly consuming the peace of others. I believe that true love is never blind. It must be rooted in an unshakable foundation of mutual respect and personal accountability. When we enable someone's chronic irresponsibility, we are not actually saving them. We are merely funding their moral decline. This narrative beautifully illustrates that silence is not a sign of weakness or dementia, but can be the focused strategy of a deeply resilient soul. Aging should never mean fading into the background of your own life, or becoming entirely invisible to the people you raised. We must honor the calluses and sacrifices of our elders, recognizing that the roofs over our heads were built by their relentless sweat. Doris's choice to reclaim her home proves that dignity has no expiration date, and that justice sometimes requires a firm, unyielding hand. It reminds us that family ties are a privilege to be honored through daily gratitude, not a legal license to exploit someone's kindness. In my view, exposing a painful truth is infinitely more compassionate than maintaining a comfortable yet destructive lie. Life has a profound way of humbling those who treat the open-ended generosity of others as their personal piggy bank. Every choice we make writes a permanent sentence in our legacy, and arrogance will always lead to an eventual grounding reality check. To live a deeply meaningful life, each of us must learn to balance our natural empathy with a fierce commitment to self-preservation. We are all fully capable of detaching from toxic patterns and actively sewing a completely new garment of personal freedom. Ultimately, this powerful perspective invites us to cherish our hard-earned peace, guard our emotional boundaries, and always protect our inner light. Disclaimer: this story and the accompanying commentary are created solely for educational, motivational, and entertainment purposes. The characters, events, and legal scenarios depicted are entirely fictional and intended to inspire personal reflection on human values, boundaries, and family dynamics. This content does not constitute legal, financial, medical, or psychological advice.